morning and welcome to Toronto Remembers D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. My name is Barbara Sullivan. I'm the Chief of Protocol for the City of Toronto, and I will be your MC this morning. To start today's proceedings, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit, Métis, and peoples. We also acknowledge that the Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, we remember those D-Day veterans who fought and died for our country, and we recognize their sacrifices to our freedom. I now ask you to rise, if you are able, for the parade, and please remain standing until after the act of remembrance. invite Miss June Rudd forward. Miss Rudd is with the Women's Royal Naval Service, and she served on D-Day as a code writer.
This is the act of remembrance. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Rudd. Please be seated. I now call upon His Worship, John Tory, Mayor of Toronto.
Good morning, one and all, and I welcome you here at this very important ceremony on behalf of all of the members of Toronto City Council, including in particular our Deputy Mayor Denzil Menon-Wong and Councillor Jennifer McKelvey, who are here, and I'm sure I'm extending the welcome on behalf of us all, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day and the invasion of Normandy, France. A historic day on which Canadian and other Allied troops began to retake Europe. A key turning point in the Second World War, a key day in the history of Western democracy. I particularly want to welcome the Consuls General of countries which stood shoulder to shoulder with us on D-Day and in the Battle of Normandy. The bonds forged between our countries during that war and during that time remain strong and will never be forgotten. And most of all, I am proud to welcome here today the D-Day veterans and their families in attendance, including Honorary Speaker Captain Martin Maxwell, a glider pilot, Regiment British 6th Airborne Division member, and other members as well of the Canadian Armed Forces who are in attendance this morning. It is a privilege and an honor for all of us to be here with you this morning, those who have served and those who continue to serve, to mark this, the 75th anniversary of D-Day and the Allied invasion of Normandy. And to once again salute your service and your courage, in respect of which we owe so much. We are gathered this morning to remember and to be grateful. We are here to remind ourselves of this time in history so that we may help preserve its significance, and we are here to once again learn the eternal lessons that come from that time and from those terrible events, and to ensure that they're never forgotten. At this hour, on this day, 75 years ago, soldiers, many of whom called Toronto home, were fighting for their lives and for the lives of our ancestors, and therefore, by definition, fighting for all of us. It would have been hell. On that early morning of June 6, 1944, more than 14,000 Canadian soldiers, including many brave Torontonians, stormed Juno Beach in Normandy, France. Their courage and their determination led to some successes in those early morning hours, but that success came at a huge price. At least 50 Toronto residents lost their lives on June 6th, 75 years ago today, as did 359 other Canadian soldiers from across our great country. Toronto's Queen's Own Rifles sustained the highest casualties of any Canadian unit on D-Day. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops raided other beach locations that day. And it should never be forgotten that while the fighting was a continent away from here, on the home front here in Toronto, thousands of Torontonians worked to support our troops who were fighting on foreign soil, far away from their families and loved ones and friends. Those residents of Toronto ensured that our troops had what they needed to fight for liberation. Ships, planes, weapons, munitions, and clothing were all manufactured here in Toronto and sent on to support the war effort. Many Canadians learned of the D-Day invasion early in the morning, 75 years ago today, on the radio. As word spread, Torontonians gathered in the streets and prayed. In fact, they prayed here, right outside the old City Hall. They came together to show support for the brave soldiers fighting for our freedoms. Thankfully, those prayers were answered. Many veterans who survived those battles later decided to immigrate to and live in Toronto after the war. D-Day and Arnhem veteran Captain Martin Maxwell was one of those soldiers. He enlisted in the British Army in 1942 and was among the first few to land in Normandy the night before D-Day aboard one of the first 6 gliders. Martin will share some of the details of his story and experiences with us during that battle. When you listen to his stories or read the transcripts of so many brave Canadians who took part in D-Day, their evident courage and their determination is overwhelming. When I reflect on the day, on the bravery of the thousands of Canadian troops, especially those from Toronto, who fought for our freedoms, I am filled, as many of you are, I'm sure, with both pride and with sadness. I'm proud, as we all are, of those who fought for us, but you cannot help but be sad for what they endured, for what they sacrificed, and, of course, most of all, for those who lost their lives. And sad about the devastation that, in turn, that caused for their families and for their friends. Unfortunately for all of us, there are fewer veterans able today to continue to share with us their important stories, and that will be true, of course, in the years to come. But our pride in them is as strong as it ever was. Our gratitude remains undiminished, and we recommit today to continuing to honor the courage and the sacrifice of all those who answered the call on D-Day and throughout the Second World War. We also focus on D-Day because it was such an important moment in the history of that war, when after years of tyranny, the liberation of Europe from Nazi rule began. It changed the course of the Second World War and ensured that democracy was restored in many countries where it had temporarily been extinguished. The odds would have seemed long on that day, terrifyingly long, but the sheer courage of the women and men of that greatest of generations, and the planning and the training and the determination of the Allied forces won the day. They opened a crack in Nazi Europe that ultimately led to the winning of the war. And so it is a reminder of the importance of fighting back against evil, even when the battle seems insurmountable. And it is why today and every day we should never give ground to such evil, the hatred that fueled it, and those who would seek to attack democracy or freedom and our way of life, those who would divide and polarize and incite in a way that can only take away from the solid foundation of Canadian values we defended then and which we must protect always. We owe it to those who fought on D-Day and throughout the Second World War and all wars to make sure that they are never forgotten. 76 ans plus tard, il est toujours important de remercier ceux qui ont servi et sacrifié et de promettre de ne jamais oublier. And we must make sure that we honor their courage and sacrifices by building and growing and protecting the city and the country and the values that they sought to protect and preserve on that D-Day. So let us all leave here today with that commitment fresh in our hearts and demonstrated in our actions. I believe this will ensure that we never again will a generation be called upon to come to war, to go to war, or be asked to undertake as Herculean an effort as the Allied operation on that June 6th in 1944, 75 years ago today. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm honored to introduce Mr. Martin Maxwell, our D-Day veteran, to speak today.
My D-Day started on June the 5th. Our commanding officer, General Browning, came in and said, "Boys, we've trained for this for a long time. You are the first ones in, so I have to tell you some of you will not be back. So here is paper, envelopes, and pens to write to your loved ones, just in case you don't come back." He said, "Let us remember the firebombing of London, done to kill as many civilians as possible. Let us remember total destruction almost of Coventry. So that late night, 6 gliders were lined up, each carrying approximately 20 to 23. Our job is to go across and capture Pegasus Bridge. So the Germans couldn't send reinforcements from the back and wouldn't have to fight them to France. We landed perfectly except one of the gliders. We had to kill the guards and those standing by. We couldn't use our rifles or pistols. And for us to do this at that age, to kill with knives and bayonets, was something that I have never forgotten. We were successful, and we saw the most amazing event happening. I have here the Globe and Mail, dated June the 7th. And if you turn it inside out, you will see something that Canadians should be proud of, because they advanced more than anybody else. About 2 years ago, I went to Holland to help them celebrate the 70th anniversary. And I went to the cemetery where 1,700 of my division lay buried. And as I was walking around, I saw crosses, Stars of David, names. The saddest for me were those graves that had nothing. Just here lies a soldier. And a man approached me. He had 3 children with him. And he said, I brought these children here to show them what sacrifices were needed and made so that we Dutch and others can live in peace. The most amazing thing for me was, and for the 60th anniversary, 10,000 of us went from here. For the 70th, we were barely 75. But what amazed me were 250,000 Dutch people lined the streets to thank us. And I remember one special incident. A young girl, about 12, with long blonde hair, when we stopped, came over, she handed me a flower, and she grabbed my hand, and she gave me an envelope. And the television people next to me said, could we find out what's in the envelope? And I read it to them. It said, so many, many years ago you came and fought, and many of you died. You saved my Oma, my grandmother. She was sick, and you gave her medicine. She was hungry, and you gave her food. And then you threw food from the planes so that we, the Dutch people, will not die of hunger. That's why I'm here today, to shake your hand and say thank you. And as I marched further on the cemetery, I came across something that I always carry with me. It simply said, when you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrows, we gave our today. And today, we remember. We thank them for the tomorrows they gave us. And we also remember and thank those who fought and came back, but the passage of time has taken them away from us. I have been speaking for many, many years, universities, schools, and I always end this way. There are so few of us left, so we're handing over the torch of freedom to you. Hold it high so others can see how precious freedom is. And if ever you're called on to fight for it, do it with everything you have, because once it is lost, it is almost impossible to get back. God bless our great country, Canada, and God bless each one of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maxwell, and thank you for your service. I now call upon Mr. Marc Tourouet, Consul General of France in Toronto.
Mayor John Tory, member of the Council of Toronto, D-Day veterans, colleagues from the Consular Corps, ladies and gentlemen. 75 years ago, the Overlord operation launched in total 3 million soldiers from the Allied forces to the beaches of Normandy, now known and forever as Utah, Omaha, Gold, Sword, and of course Juno Beach. The incredible sacrifices made by an entire generation of young people, sometimes very young people, led to the liberation of France and of all Europe from the Nazi barbary. In recognition of these sacrifices, France has bestowed the Légion d'honneur, the highest-ranking French award, to over 1,000 Canadians over the last few years. We are blessed today to having with us some of them, Mr. Martin Maxwell, that we just heard, Mr. Joseph Gagné, Mr. Gordon Littlejohn, Mr. Charles Clyde, and Mrs. Jude Trudd. Thank you so much for being there today and for being there yesterday. Today in Normandy, the world celebrates the peace that followed that incredible times. The European Union came out from the reconciliation from yesterday's enemies, France and Germany. The United Nations were recreated to prevent wars and to enforce peace and security. All the present international order is somehow born on these beaches of Normandy 75 years ago. This international order, based on cooperation, mutual respect, and the rule of law, is our most precious collective good. Here in this great city of Toronto, blessed by its diversity and the spirit of tolerance, lest we forget the sacrifice made for us to be able to live in peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Consul General. I now invite Reverend Greg Armstrong to lead us in a prayer.
It's a sincere privilege and honor to be with you this morning, all our honored guests, and most especially our veterans, and to be able to say thank you for that. As Mayor Tory reminded us, there was a day when people stood in this very place to pray, and so this morning we have that privilege to do that, and I would ask you and invite you to join me in prayer. God, we thank you for the precious gift of life, for this day and this opportunity. Holy Scriptures tell us that there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for another. Today, we thank you for those who lived out that very truth in selfless sacrifice, serving our nation, this province, and the communities within. Even today, 75 years later, we are deeply moved and grateful for the brave men and women who daily went above and beyond in answering the call, risking their lives, and for some, many in fact, ultimately giving their all in service within our Canadian Armed Forces. For the peace, protection, safety, and well-being of our citizens and this great nation that were secured, we give thanks. They were alive. They lived and loved and laughed and even cried. They had vision and dreams and goals. And they answered the call to serve, and they did so willingly and wholeheartedly. Their lives were not lived in vain, but with purpose and pride and great gain. We remember and honor each of them today and they will never be forgotten. We give you thanks that you have created within each of us the ability to remember and for memory, and we ask that our memories would remain sharp and sustaining, lest we forget any and the sacrifices they made, for they have earned our respect and admiration with their very lives. For the days, the months, the years ahead, we would ask for your sustaining guidance, strength, courage, and hope. God grant that the very courageous lives that we are paying tribute to today would live on in our hearts, their loved ones, and continue to be an inspiration to all of us for the rest of our days. Might we commit today to continue to pray for our troops, past and present, and their families, and might we live lives worthy of the sacrifices that they made for each of us. Hear our prayers, strong God of mercy, and we thank you for the freedoms that were fought for and won that allow us today to end this prayer according to our various traditions. Let the followers of Christ pray through Jesus Christ our Lord. Let the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Moses pray to the Holy One of Israel. And let all of us pray to the God of our own understanding. And in solidarity we say, Amen.
I now invite Mayor Tory to lay a wreath on behalf of City Council and the residents of Toronto. I now invite Mr. Maxwell to lay a wreath on behalf of fallen friends and comrades in arms. I invite Ms. Anne-Marie Lane, Dean of the Consular Corps and Consul General of Antigua and Barbuda, along with Mr. Marc Touret, Consul General of France, to lay a wreath on behalf of the countries involved on the day and from France where the landing took place. I want to thank everyone for coming today and for showing your support. And finally, I would like to draw your attention to the Guards of Honor as they march off the colors. This is the signal that the event has come to an end and the colors are retired for the day, which concludes our ceremony. I'll ask everyone to rise if they're able.
ceremony for today.
To your right. Yes! Yes! Goes.